everyone, welcome to the webinar. My name is Emily Taylor. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Engagement for the Solve ME CFS initiative. We thank you so much for joining us today at our second in the Back to School webinar series. Today we will be discussing Individualized Education Plans, also known as IEPs, for children with ME CFS in the public school system. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome, joining us today, Ms. Lisette Duarte. Lisette is a personal friend of mine that I enjoyed working with on many occasions in the autism community. And she is one of the best experts I know in utilizing the public laws regarding disability education to get the best services and supports available for children who are having trouble accessing the curriculum in public schools. Ms. Lisette has 2 children on the spectrum herself, in addition to a family member with ME CFS. So she is incredibly empathetic and just a wonderful, caring person, in addition to having an excellent knowledge base. A little bit about her background is on the screen now, and she will also be available via Twitter to answer questions at a later date. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Ms. Lisette Duarte to present to you today.
Thank you so much, Emily, for such a warm welcome. It's really great to be back here today. As Emily said, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not giving you legal advice. I'm a parent of 2 children, as she said, and several family members. And so I'm here just to impart some of the knowledge and experience in hopes of helping you navigate systems of care, school systems, and medical issues. So let's get started here. What we'll be covering today is the differences between a 504 and an IEP. We'll touch on that very briefly because, as Emily shared, I was here at a previous webinar where we covered 504s, and I think that's available for you to review if 504s is where you are at the moment. Today we'll be also covering eligibility, requesting an assessment, what the process and the timelines are as it pertains to requesting an assessment, the development of an IEP, an Individualized Education Program, the team, who's part of your team, what types of procedural safeguards parents and students have to protect them. If you disagree or you feel you need more information in a particular area, what independent educational evaluations are. And lastly, we'll also have some links to some sample letters that might help you with a starting point when you are requesting assessments or communicating with the school. And we'll end with how to be an effective advocate for your child or student. And we'll touch on some tips that I felt that have been successful in my journey. So let's begin. Protections under IDEA. And just a moment, let me see if I can move this slide over. I'm sorry, it's hard to see some of the text here in the presentation. So under IDEA, a student must meet the specific criteria. Under IDEA, schools must meet federal regulation and timelines. And those are really important. It's important for us to note when we make requests because they are to adhere to particular timelines, and that's really important. Under IDEA, there is a parental participation section, and when your child is eligible, if they do have an IEP, schools must meet with you annually, at least one time a year. So the eligibility, and here we'll cover, and I'm sorry, I might have to be moving this back and forth just to be able to see some of the text, so I apologize for that. The type of law and the eligibility under IDEA, students from birth through age 22, which qualify with a particular disability, needing specialized academic instruction in public schools. So that's federal law. Under Section 504, any elementary, secondary student with a disability who needs special services or accommodations, modifications to access the curriculum, not limited to learning disabilities, and post-secondary students needing academic adjustments, which means from K through 12, you're covered under IDEA. If you're eligible for an IEP, you can also be eligible for a 504, but your 504 can continue when you leave the K-12 system. You do have protections if we have some older teens or adults trying to access services that are not quite the same, but you do have some protections under a 504 and ADA when you attend community college or university. So to be eligible, you must meet particular criteria. And an individual with a disability means someone who has a physical impairment, a mental impairment that limits their life abilities, and it must have an impact for them to be able to it must impact them in the way that they are accessing the curriculum, which means they should be able to have the supports and services and make meaningful progress and participation as every other student without a disability. So here we are, the disability definition. And under IDEA, there are 13 specific disabilities that are covered. We'll be focusing today on ME/CFS, which generally falls into other health impaired, but you also can qualify under OHI for a 504. And here we will be covering what that process looks like. So it's the special education process. And this is the gist of it. So your child has, let's start with the scenario that currently your child has a 504 and the accommodations or the medical accommodations aren't enough. You have the right to request an evaluation for special education. You must do that in writing. If you must give the school or the district 15 calendar days to respond to your request. They can say yes, they can say no, and we'll talk about the path of if they say no a little further along in the slides. But for the most part, you request your assessment. The school district has 15 days to provide you with an assessment plan. The parent then has 15 days to review the assessment plan and decide whether they will allow the school district to assess. If you're requesting this assessment, more than likely you want this assessment, and so it would be really helpful if you don't take up those 15 days, because again, there's timelines associated with this entire process. And so you signing that and returning it and always keeping a copy for your records is the next step. Once you provide that informed consent, that you allow them to assess your child, and the assessment plan is important to review because if you're having them evaluated for the first time, special education services, you want to have a full, comprehensive, thorough evaluation. By that, I mean, you want them to assess in other areas that maybe are not on that assessment plan. You have the right to request them to assess in a particular area. For example, they're only testing for academic and a psychoeducational assessment, but you really want them to cover some issues with sensory integration, for example, of children who are on the spectrum. So then you would request also an occupational therapy assessment. All of this is on the assessment plan. It'll tell you who is assessing in what particular area and what they will be assessing. But it's your right to, at that point, before you sign and return back to the school. If there's an area that's not covered that you feel should be covered, for example, a speech and language assessment or an assistive technology assessment or an adaptive PE assessment that isn't necessarily in the bulk of the what you would say normal assessments that they conduct, this is an assessment that you can request. So you've signed it, you've returned it, you agree with the areas that they're going to assess. The district then has 60 days to complete the evaluation. Within the 60 days, they will assess your child. They will give you questionnaires in which you have the opportunity to provide your parental input. You are an integral part of this team, and so your input is important. And at this point, it's important to be thorough and communicate with your assessor, whoever that may be. Any medical issues, being very specific. This way they can take all of the information, how your child is functioning, what their medical needs are, how it impacts them throughout the educational day. This is all very critical information that is required, or you should be providing to the school. That way you have a very clear and comprehensive assessment. And it's important for the school to know how their medical issues impact them throughout the educational day. And so as parents, it's our, when we're, communicating with the school, we have to be very thorough about this information. So they assess, they meet with your child, they observe them across different environments in the school, during unstructured time like recess, different times of the day. This is how they collect their information as part of the comprehensive evaluation. And within those 60 days, they should be providing you with the reports. And as a parent tip, it's always important to ask. So LAUSD has a checkbox that you can check to request the assessments 3 to 5 days prior to your meeting. More than likely, these will be 20+ page assessments, depending on which areas you're requesting or which areas are covering. So you're talking maybe 4 or 5 assessments, 20+ pages long, a lot of information to cover. In order for you to be a meaningful participant in this process, it's important for you to have this information prior to the meeting. It's important for you to check for accuracy. Sometimes the information that are covered in these assessments is not accurate. And so this is an opportunity for you to review, again, give feedback, check for understanding. And at this point, if you are requesting an evaluation, you will more than likely be exposed to many different acronyms. Often school officials speak in acronyms, and so again, asking for clarity, asking questions, making sure you understand the process so you're a meaningful participant is important. 2 things can happen. Your child might be eligible or might not. If your child is not eligible, not identified as having a disability that impacts them accessing the curriculum, more than likely what happens is they monitor the process, they provide some accommodations, they consult with the teacher, they give some suggestions on what would be helpful, but you have the right to disagree. And there is a process that we'll be discussing that you can access to ask for independent educational evaluations. Sometimes it might be helpful to go out and not only get evaluations that are covered by the purchased by the school district, but also information from your private doctor, your private physician, information that you could bring to the table as well, not necessarily through an IEE, but maybe through your medical doctor. If the child is identified, then the team develops the IEP, and in the next slides, we'll go over what that looks like. At the minimum, they should meet with you annually But as a parent, you have the right to request a meeting if there's a change, if you want to communicate something. If it's not written into this special education program for your student, they're not mandated or required to do anything that you're requesting. And so we can, I think at a later date, we might be able to dive into what the actual IEP document looks like. Today is an overview, but just as another parent tip, if what you're requesting or something that they're doing for your child that is helping them access a curriculum and learn is not written into the actual document as an accommodation on the accommodations page, they're not required to do it. In other words, if it's just written in the section where you're discussing the meeting, in the meeting notes section, they're not required to do anything. And that's a common mistake that many parents make when they're trying to learn how to navigate this process. And in fact, I had made. And so, trial and error, this is how we learn. And so making sure that this information, if it's any service or anything that the school district is saying that they're going to provide, if it's not written into the actual document, then they're not required to provide that support or service. So under this process, the next section is, as I mentioned, you can agree or disagree, and these are your due process rights under IDEA. So what do they look like? As I mentioned, the school district requires your consent to implement the IEP, so they cannot begin the program that they're offering unless they have your signature. So let's say you go through the entire process and you don't want the services and supports that they're providing, you have the right to opt out and continue with your 504 if that's what you want, but they cannot implement anything without your parental consent. They must provide, so as part of your due process rights, there's a form that you can complete if you disagree your child was eligible. There's a system in place for you to disagree and go through due process. It's not recommended for you to go through due process without an advocate or an attorney, but some parents do choose. We have some savvy parents that do feel confident enough to proceed forward. But again, there are timelines and particular things that need to be filed. It's a very legally procedure. So you can agree, you can disagree with the identification, so the eligibility. So you might not want the OHI, you might want a different eligibility. You might disagree with the particular evaluation. Oftentimes, the biggest area that parents disagree in is the placement, and that can look very different for the ME/CFS community. Oftentimes, maybe the medical issues that they're experiencing or the challenges with medical challenges might lead you to wanting a homeschool placement, or so that can look very different. But oftentimes where parents and school districts get to an impasse is the placement. There is a hearing officer involved. If you have a current IEP and the school district is saying we want to reduce a service or change a service, there's something called stay put, but you must notify the school district that you disagree with their offer and you want everything to stay in place, and the services and supports that are in your last signed IEP stay in place until your dispute is resolved. And all of this is enforced by the U.S. Department of Education and the Office of Special Education, and it's gone through the Office of Administrative Hearings. There's a lot of information online about the due process, but we're just touching on it lightly today. At this point, I know I've covered a lot of information, and so Emily, if we have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Lisette, so much for stopping for questions. At this time, there are no questions, but we do have a nice wave and shout out from Sharon on Facebook. So hello, Sharon. Thank you for watching. And that's all. I think you can keep going. Everyone's coming along great.
Perfect. Thank you. Sharon, thank you for joining us. Feel free to ask any questions, and thank you for the nice wave. So we'll get into the process. So the development of the plan, and this slide, I think it's based. So oftentimes I do help parents, not just in California, but across the US. And so I try to keep the slides pretty generalized, but this here is a slide from another state. Typically, if you suspect that your child has a disability, you request for an evaluation, and this is what we've already covered. Your evaluation is conducted, the results are shared in a meeting, it's determined that your child is eligible, and then you are classified under a particular eligibility. In this instance, we're using OHI as an example. Again, this is just a recap. In order for them to implement what they are proposing, you must sign in order for them to implement what their offer is. So again, at any point, if you disagree with a decision or a proposed service or removal of a service, you have the legal right to request state mediation and/or due process. And here, I just want to make sure that we cover the assessment timeline. So what we're covering here is what those are. And so again, this is a slide that's geared towards California. And so I just want to recap these assessment timelines, because often I know with the day-to-day of caring for our children or possibly our own medical needs, caring for not only our child that is affected by ME/CFS, but other family members or other children. Oftentimes, it's very challenging to follow these calendar timelines. And so something that was really helpful to me was if I submitted a request in writing and I kept a copy. There are ways in which you deliver this information so it can be sent in an email, but I often recommend you hand delivering it to the district or the school so you can get a date, timestamp, and a signature of somebody that has received it. That way you have proof of when that timeline began. I often put reminders into my cell phone because everybody has their cell phones with them at all times. And so this is just another parent tip that I can track and monitor so that I can follow up, because oftentimes there are many of these requests that are submitted and paperwork gets lost in the shuffle. And so in order for us to complete this process in a timely manner, we should be following the assessment timelines. And so again, as I said, your written request, they have 15 days to respond to provide you with an assessment plan. That again, you have at least 15 days to review and approve and consent. And then the assessment team meets, they assess, and they have a meeting with you. And if your child is eligible, then the development of the IEP begins. Once your signature is received, the implementation should happen immediately. If there is some type of service that they cannot begin immediately, they should tell you. If they don't tell you, then you should ask, when is that service going to begin? What's the duration of the service? Who is my point of contact? Oftentimes school districts contract out. Sometimes there are long wait lists. Not to say that that is your responsibility to follow through, but they should be providing you with that information at the meeting. But again, with every system, it's not perfect. And so it's important for you to track, monitor, ask questions, ask when that particular service is going to be delivered, where, who is going to be providing that service, and again, the contact information in case you have any questions. And again, at the minimum, they should be reviewing this plan annually. So what is the assessment going to cover? And again, I'm just kind of reiterating some of the information that we discussed in the previous slides, because when I was a parent, when I was starting a journey with the assessment process with my own children, This process wasn't clear to me, and so when it became clear, I felt like I had a better handle on what to expect, and allowed me to be better prepared as a parent. And so when the initial referral of the evaluation, this is exactly how it's outlined in the succession and the order of the process. So again, the evaluation, the eligibility, the development of the plan. When they develop a plan, they discuss what the placement will be, what the instruction will be, and the instruction could be if they are on a diploma track, they get the general curriculum. Oftentimes, parents opt, depending on, the needs of your child, if you want a certificate of completion, and then that would mean that your curriculum is modified. You're not getting those A through G requirements that you need to apply for community college or higher education. And so there's 2 tracks. So and this is also covered during the planning meeting, but parents have the right to request for, alternative curriculum or modified curriculum. And it's important for you to ask questions about how the instruction is going to be delivered. But this is all very individualized and based on the needs of your child. And again, you review this plan annually, but if you feel that there is something that you want to add or remove or change, or something isn't working, you can request a meeting, and they should provide you with a meeting notice and hold a meeting within 30 days. That doesn't always happen, but it's important for you to know that you don't have to wait for a year in order for you to reconvene with your team and ask questions. So who is your team and what is it made up of? So the student obviously is the focus. Depending on, this is a very personal choice. Oftentimes parents only bring in the student for a short amount of time. For me, I thought it was always important because my goal for my children was for them to self-advocate. I can't always be there. I'm not always there throughout the educational day, across all environments. It was important for me to teach them that there is a team behind everything that is happening, and they're there to provide you the support that they need. So I always made it a point to identify an ally at the school, somebody that they felt they could come to. My children also present with a lot of anxiety, and because of the autism, sometimes they're hindered socially. And so for me, it was important for them to know that they could go to somebody at the school if they didn't feel comfortable going to the office or talking to the teacher. And so I share all of this because I gradually started bringing them in short increments, just so they can meet their team. Sometimes it was better for them to communicate, who better to say it than the person who, is impacting them throughout the educational day. And so my children have been able to verbalize, this isn't working, or, I need this support, or this makes me uncomfortable. And so for them to verbalize it in front of their team, even if it's, bringing them in for 5 minutes so that they can participate. And, as time progresses, depending on their age, skill, and ability level, teaching them self-advocacy skills, for me, it was something that was really important. So who is the team made up of? There should be a regular education teacher there, somebody from the school district. Oftentimes they send a representative, but it isn't always the case, but definitely somebody who can make decisions on behalf of the school district. If your child is in middle school or high school, there's more than likely this is a transition agency. So maybe if your child is a regional center client, or you will be accessing the Department of Rehab, these are other systems in place that support our students when they're older. The parents, a very important part of the team. Others that have special knowledge or expertise. By that, I mean oftentimes my children communicated things that they didn't feel comfortable communicating at the school. They always had a therapist outside of school. So this allowed me to bring in another professional that was an ally, that understood my child's needs and was able to help advocate on behalf of my child. Also, there should be somebody there that can interpret the evaluation results. For example, if you had an assessment in a particular area, for example, a speech evaluation, then that speech pathologist should be there. But definitely, if they cannot, for scheduling conflicts, there is somebody there that can interpret the results. And if your child is in special education already, so if it's an annual review, it would be the special education teacher. And anybody else that you feel has special knowledge or that you want to invite. Oftentimes, I'm very fortunate to have a very supportive husband, and so we made decisions together. That isn't always the case, though. You can bring a friend, a relative, an aunt, an uncle, somebody that can just be there for moral support, somebody that can help you take notes. It's a lot of information. Oftentimes, there's a lot of people in the room, and when it's about your child, sometimes we can get very emotional. And so bringing somebody else there that's a familiar face that can help provide that moral support or take notes or simply just be there for you, for me, I felt it's been very beneficial. So let's get into it now. What's an IEP? So you've gone through all this process. Your child is eligible. What is covered? So there's always a baseline where they begin, what they call the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. This describes how the child is currently functioning, how the child's disability affects his or her involvement in the process and accessing the curriculum. So where is your child at? How does he learn? And how does the disability impact them throughout the educational day? This all happens with the identification of what the needs are, because the needs will drive the goals. So the assessments will highlight what the deficits or the needs are. And you should be creating goals to address a particular skill that you want mastered, a particular behavior that you want to curb, a self-advocacy skill that you want them to learn. These goals are written for a year span. And the team presents goals, they're draft goals, but you as a parent have the right to ask for a goal in a particular area that maybe they didn't think about covering. And so this is where, your parental participation comes in. They don't always know how to best meet the medical needs. And so if you know that something really works and your child responds to it, this is where you bring this information, and the team should be supportive in helping you write that goal or propose a different goal. These goals, again, are for a year span, and they break them down incrementally. So what your child should be able to do in a month, in 3 months, in 6 months, in a year. And goals are something that I know a lot of parents struggle with, but basically in the assessments that were done, the needs are identified, and that's how you devise goals. So what are the areas that your child is having challenges with? And that's how you kind of address the development of the goals. The special education and related services. So related services, your child needs counseling, and so they're going to provide DIS counseling throughout the educational day, or your child needs occupational therapy service, and they're going to, contract with somebody outside. You have the right to request a non-public agency. Oftentimes they want to start with district employees, but depending on where you live, if it's a small district, they might not have that particular person contracted on staff at the district, and so they contract out. your child could really benefit from things like an assistive technology device. Again, that's not something that's always that's highly utilized, but it was very effective for one of my children, and so they didn't have a staff, a district staff who had a particular expertise in that area, and so we contracted out. How much of the day your child will be instructed? So oftentimes, you can get pulled out and provide the service, and they will tell you in the IEP plan if they're going to be providing a particular service in group or individualized, and the duration, how many minutes a week, how many minutes a month. And all of this information is going to be outlined in the IEP plan when they develop it. How much of the time is your child going to be separated from their peers? This is the service minutes are highlighted in the plan. And oftentimes parents don't know, but you do have the right to opt out for testing. So in the plan, it'll also say if they're going to be participating in statewide or district testing, if it's going to be modified or changed, and they should also provide you the information and you can also provide suggestions on, if your child could benefit from a small testing environment, testing one-on-one with your child, and what the support that your child needs to be able to be successful in taking some of these assessments. But again, you could opt out if that's something that might cause your child too much stress or anxiety. This is all information that we need to gauge, and it's very individualized based on how your child is feeling and what educational environment they're in. So are they homebound, or if they are, sometimes they have you have a proctor, a testing person come and meet with you in your home or at a library. This is all information that's discussed at the annual review. And then they also provide you information on how they will measure this progress towards your annual goals. And I know this is a lot of information that we're covering. It's a very involved process. It's taking me years to be able to navigate and understand this process. And so we're so fortunate that these slides and information are going to be made available to you after this presentation. So now we're going to cover what it should actually contain. And I did go into some of the detail, but again, it starts with your child's present levels, the annual goals, what progress your child will be making annually, what are the related supports or supplementary aids and services that your child needs, a statement about any program modifications, who the personnel at the school will be in charge of implementing and supporting your student, and an explanation of how much time your child will be pulled out. Will this instruction be provided individual or in group, and the duration and the frequency, and what the individual accommodations are that are necessary for your child to make progress, and the projected date of when the services will begin. And all of this information, again, it is a lot, and it's just a recap of some of the things that we already covered. So an overview, I'm going to recap at this moment of the introductions. Begin at the beginning of your meeting. This is an opportunity for you to meet. Sometimes you just meet people virtually or over the phone, but you'll actually get to see if the assessor is available, who conducted the assessment, so you can ask questions. They'll provide you with all of the material that they use to determine the eligibility, but there is other information that you can request. Oftentimes it's not a request that, parents make. Sometimes it's when you're working with an educational advocate, they want to see if the child was not eligible or how they determined their results. You can ask for the protocols, which are the test measures and the assessments that they use to determine this information. Oftentimes, educational advocates or educational therapists help us kind of go into detail about what these assessments look like and what information they use to determine eligibility. At this meeting, they'll discuss the results with you, and they'll provide you with the information of a draft of the goals, and that's where you provide input again. And this is just a recap slide of what we already covered. And we touched on, the designated instruction, so where it's going to happen, the related services, what those are. Is your child need some kind of therapeutic, recreational therapy, adaptive PE, counseling services? All of that will be outlined in this document. And then what are the supplementary aids and supports that are going to be provided, if any? So here, something that is really important, another area that we should really learn some of these acronyms. And it's sometimes they talk about acronyms and they don't tell you what they mean. And so I always ask questions because I wanted to be informed and I wanted to know and I wanted to understand this process. But something that's really important is something that they're required to by the law is provide your child with something that's called FAPE, a free appropriate public education. And so, what does that mean? It means that it requires the IEP plan to provide you with what the educational benefit is that is appropriate. It could mean that your child needs to be placed in a special day class or in general education. Oftentimes the placement is associated with the term that they utilize, free appropriate public education. So it's free, it's appropriate for the individual needs of your child. You're in public school, so it's a public education, and you're entitled to supports and services that your child needs in order to learn like every other child without a disability. And again, we covered what some of those are. It's speech and language, occupational therapy, sometimes transportation. And there are some protections under FAPE for 504. And we discussed that during a previous webinar, but this is a little bit of more information for you to kind of get familiarized if you want that information on this slide. So what are your rights? Your rights for a least restrictive environment, and again, as I mentioned before, oftentimes where parents come to a disagreement with the school district after they've identified, assessed, gone through the evaluation process, they've highlighted what the areas are of need, and now they discuss where they're going to provide these services. And so they use the term least restrictive environment, and that's really open to, people have different perspectives or ideas of what that is, but the team as a whole makes a decision, where is your child going to receive the instruction with students who are not disabled. What they decide is what the services that are needed. They consider all of the information, and then they offer a placement of a general education or a special day class. It's really very individualized, but parents could disagree with what that placement looks like, and then you can go through the normal succession of how you disagree with the decision, and that we just briefly touched on that in due process. But this is another one of your parent and student rights, is you could disagree with the offer of where they're going to be providing this particular service for your student or your child. So they've developed the plan. You don't have to sign right there and then. Oftentimes there's so much information that is covered you know, there's a lot of information that you have to consider. And for me, I always need that wiggle room to digest, to make a decision before I sign, because this is, you're going into a legal contract with the school district. So once you sign, you know, you're saying, I agree to what your offer is for my child so that they can have a free, appropriate public education. And so oftentimes parents don't know, they don't have to sign right there and then. They can take it home. You know, there isn't any legal time frame, but you know, it's good to get back to them. You know, a good rule of thumb is within 5 days. If after you've left this meeting, you feel that you have more questions or you wanted to clarify something in a particular area, there's always a designee or somebody that they identify to you as a case carrier, which is your point of contact, and you can call them and ask them questions. So I want to get into this a little more into detail, because oftentimes, you know, parents don't know, and I didn't know when I was beginning this process, that I can consent to the entire IEP, which is the offer, the supports, the services, the placement as a whole, or you can sign it and you say that I only disagree with this particular service. For example, I only want, you know, speech and OT, and at this point, I don't think that my child needs adaptive PE services. You can consent to some parts, or you can disagree. You can disagree with it in whole, and then you can go through file for due process. But you should know that it has been known to happen. It doesn't happen often, but if you do not sign and you do not agree and you do nothing, you don't consent to the offer of a free or appropriate education, the district may file against you. It doesn't always happen, but it's important for you to know that information. And at this point, we'll be covering what an individualized education evaluation is, but the district may refuse or accept your request for an independent evaluation. And that's a good segue into that slide. So you disagree with a particular assessment. You feel that the assessment was not thorough. It didn't cover all of the areas that they said they were. It had a lot of information in there that wasn't accurate. They didn't consider any medical information that you brought to the table outside assessments that you had done. You can request an independent educational evaluation at public expense. And so let's say you disagree with all or parts of the school district evaluation, and you believe your child needs a second opinion or somebody who has a particular expertise in a particular area, and you want them to, you want the district to pay for an independent educational evaluation. You must put this request in writing. And you must let them know that you will be, so you can let them know verbally at the meeting. You can say you disagree, and then you can follow up with those next steps. They will provide you with a list of assessors if they agree with your request. You don't have to choose somebody on that list. Oftentimes, you know, as parents, it's important for us to have a network of support, or a group, or a support group that you attend, or other parents that understand this process, or your child has a particular diagnosis, and you know, you align yourself with some of those groups. That has been really helpful to me, because getting support from other parents or recommendations from other parents has been really helpful. So why I'm bringing that up at this point is oftentimes parents ask other parents, I'm getting an evaluation, an independent educational evaluation, and you know, this is the list of the assessors. Do you know these assessors? Do you feel that, you know, they were neutral and they provided a very neutral opinion? Because this is an opportunity for you to get a very thorough comprehensive evaluation by somebody who's independent, and oftentimes they make recommendations for goals and placements. And when we are going to be seeking who that evaluator is, a question that I didn't know that we could ask is, will you be attending this meeting? And if you can't attend in person, will you be going over this report over the phone? I know that in our community, sometimes parents say, well, they did a wonderful evaluation and they just submitted it to the school district and they weren't there to actually talk about what it is that they covered. And so that's not really beneficial. And so these are kind of questions. And I provide a link at the end of this presentation that goes into more in depth about when you request an IEE and some questions that you can ask, and then also provide you a template for a form letter if you feel that that might be something that you need. So part of the IEP is also the transition planning. It should begin no later than your child's 16th birthday. Again, this is transition related services and supports if your child is going to be seeking secondary education. Something that you have to keep in mind is this probably won't pertain to some of the ME/CFS community, but oftentimes parents who have children that are more impacted by a disability, for example, autism, you know, they feel that they need to conserve their child, or they need to get supported decision-making supports in place. There's something called age of majority that you should start exploring before they turn 18, and it kind of grants you some protections and educational rights. If you don't have some of these legal documents in place and your child is 18, you are no longer able to contribute or make decisions. Sometimes I hear it happening when your child turns 18 and you take them to a doctor's appointment. Sometimes they don't allow you to be in that appointment. And so this is very individualized. This is something for you to consider in the future, depending on the age of your child. But there's information here about what that looks like if you need to explore that. And then we go into the school health plans. So when our children are medically fragile and they require complex health support, what does that look like? We should develop, you know, oftentimes these are used for 504s, and you can also use them for IEPs. But what is the need? What is the frequency? Some potential emergencies. You know, you should identify who the nurse is and provide her with all this information. School should have what the healthcare needs that your child needs to be addressed and supported with on a daily basis. And we just are going into partnering with your physician. Again, it's really important to have, you know, that rapport, that communication, you know, establishing a really strong relationship with whoever your medical provider is, because we often need medical information, doctor's notes. They can provide information to the school that might help accommodate or help communicate some of your child's health needs. And then if your child might need some nurse staffing support to administer medication, all of this information is really important for us to have a very, I have a wonderful pediatrician, and he really understands, you know, my child's complex health needs, both of them. And, you know, oftentimes his support, his recommendations, his notes have really helped smooth the process with the school, because, you know, it's not always easy. But again, this also is aligned with your free appropriate public education. It requires an appropriate plan that's comparable to educating students who don't have disabilities. So if your child needs a special health plan, then the IEP team should help develop it with your input and your medical provider's input. Oftentimes we don't always touch on what a emergency for a health plan would be. So what are the instructions that the school needs to know about to provide the specific medical support in case of an emergency? So power outages, school lockdowns, fire drills, how do they access, and, you know, if they're in a wheelchair, like all of these, how do you respond in a timely manner? When should you call the local ambulance? Like all of these things should be considered, and they should also be discussed in developing the IEP and the health plan. So what to do in case of an emergency is critical. And then we covered a little bit about, you know, what that looks like. And then we can go into here, what are some of the accommodations? And so sample accommodations for IEPs, I'm going to, for the sake of time, I know we're like at the 11, the hour marker, I'm going to allow you to review this information at your leisure. So what to do to communicate absences, missed assignments, books and materials that are needed, anything that's part of the accommodations that's in an IEP. Does your child need frequent breaks? What to do if your child needs to have water throughout the day, a water bottle at their desks? All of these medical needs should be highlighted and communicated to the school. So communication and building strong partnerships with the school. Again, as I said, find your ally when gathering information to provide, especially with chronic medical issues or ME/CFS, gathering the facts and providing them to the school. They don't always know how the diagnosis and their medical, they don't always know how to support somebody who's medically fragile or has a lot of medical needs. Know who to contact in case that you have concerns. Practice what to say before you say it. Oftentimes, it's can be taxing and overwhelming to communicate. So writing it down before you make those phone calls, just practicing effective communication with the school because it's something that you're going to have to be doing on an ongoing basis. And, this is just my little IEP checklist. It's not an all-encompassing list, but I try to keep everything organized. I try to take notes before the meeting, bring somebody with you. Another really important point that I wanted to make is you have the right to record your IEP meeting, but you must provide them a 24-hour notice. You have a right to, receive copies of the IEP or any assessments. You can ask for any of these things prior to the meeting to allow you to have meaningful participation and be prepared to actively participate. And, one really important one is just have a collaborative mindset. We don't always feel that school districts understand, but going in there with a collaborative mindset is also really important. These are just a few tips that I have gotten that were very helpful from parents, from school personnel, from healthcare professionals. It's, having a plan, being organized, asking questions, finding your network of support. Tips for the school is establishing a communication, a routine communication with the school, with the teacher, whoever that coordinator is. And tips from a healthcare professional, as I said, I covered some of those, but, documenting everything, being prepared. And, for me, it's always been important to involve my child in this process, based on their ability and skill set and how much they can participate. But I'm a very big proponent in empowering your child because, again, we can't always be there. And so them having the tools and the skills, if possible, to be able to self-advocate, it's important. And we're going to be providing you with some of these links, but these are some templates for how to discuss a problem, how to request records, how to follow up, how to provide feedback, how to request a meeting. This gives you an idea of some templates to use. Again, this is not all encompassing. This is just a starting point. Sometimes we just don't know where to start or how to start our letters, and this is a really useful tool that I know has been helpful for parents. So in closing, what are our closing thoughts? So again, the IEP provides more legal protections and academic assistance and supports than a 504. We discussed in length about how to request one. A 504 may be a necessary first step, but it can be utilized in conjunction. It's not always, but again, it's like your starting point. You develop a 504 with those accommodations for those medical needs, and if it isn't enough, then you have the right to request an assessment for an individualized education program. So the 504, as we know, is intended for basic medical and physical accommodations. It's not for curriculum modification or accessibility. And children with more cognitive symptoms more medical needs, need more supports, are often better candidates for an IEP. And so my very final takeaway for you is, do prioritize your child's medical needs based on the symptoms and the severity. Again, this is very individualized, and it's important for us to reflect carefully on the symptoms that affect your child accessing the curriculum. And so, sometimes we have to make those hard decisions of pulling our kids out of school because that's their needs, their urgent needs based on the symptoms and based on the severity of the symptoms. And so these are tough decisions, but there's support out there to help you make these decisions. And I hope that this webinar, I know we covered a lot of information, but I hope it was very helpful. And MECFS has some additional resources that they are going to be providing links for you here. And again, there's sample letters from this organization, DREDF. There's something called parent training centers in every state, and I think that they have been really helpful for me. And I oftentimes refer parents to find what those parent training centers are. There's one in every state. You just Google PTI. They're funded by the California Department of Education. They are to provide you with understanding of the ins and outs of special education in your state. So I encourage you to research that, and that has been very helpful to me in the process and finding support. And with that, I'm turning it over to Emily.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisette. That was amazingly helpful and really fascinating. I think we got some great information for a lot of parents out there who are really struggling with these systems of care and these systems of support in schools. We actually only had one question, and the parent asked, they said their child is severe and really needs a home-based education curriculum, and asked how to incorporate limited focus time. So they gave the example that their child can only really be focused at about 20 minutes at a time, and how to incorporate that into a home-based curriculum or IEP, and if you had some examples of how to incorporate that specific need.
I don't at this moment, but I can definitely answer that question offline. What comes to mind immediately is, again, working with your medical professional that really outlines the duration of time that your student has the capacity to focus. And so, if they're receiving homebound instruction, oftentimes, in California, I think the mandate is that teacher only comes out for 5 hours a week. And so what are you going to, when is the optimal time for your child? When are they best, more lucid or have more sustained energy? This is very individualized question. And so my recommendation would be to kind of log what a week would look like, kind of collect that data, bring that to your, medical professional, any therapist or providers that you're working with that can help you identify what are the supports that would be beneficial, and working very closely with your school district, being very forthcoming about what the doctor's recommendations are so that they can help you create what that plan looks like with your input and your medical provider's input.
Thank you, Lisa. We actually just got one more question that came in, and this question was about occupational therapy. The watcher indicated that they were not familiar that occupational therapy was available through an IEP, and they asked if you could just elaborate on that process and what kinds of occupational therapy a child with MECFS could receive.
I'm not exactly sure how they could benefit MECFS with OT. When I was giving that example, what came to mind right away was, let's say, a child with autism who had severe sensory issues. I'm not exactly sure if MECFS patients have extreme tactile or sensory sensitivities. But for example, if a child had sensory issues with the lights or needed sensory integration a sensory integration diet that's developed by an occupational therapist, you would request for a sensory integration assessment, and then they would provide what sensory supports the child could benefit during the educational environment. But there's a lot of information out there, including some of the links that we have here, but you can definitely contact me directly if you want to. I feel like I need more information, but you can definitely request an occupational therapy assessment as part of the assessment process. Again, they're supposed to be identifying and assessing all areas of suspected disability. So if the child has some of those needs, they should be assessing in that area. And if it's not on the assessment plan, you should be asking them to assess in that particular area. It really is just dependent on the needs of your child, and who knows the needs of your child and the parent. And so that's where you are part of that process in requesting assessments. And if they're not covered, then you can always ask them to add to the assessment plan. But there's a lot of information online that you can find about occupational therapy, but I'm not exactly sure if they're what the correlation or how it impacts ME/CFS patients. I'm sorry, I wish I had a more thorough response.
Thank you, Lisette. That was really helpful. That's all the questions we received, but I do want to give a little shout out to Rachel on Facebook. Gave us a heart. We heart you too, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel.
And that's all the questions we have, and we're right on time. So I just want to send a special thank you to Lisette. Thank you again for making time to share your amazing knowledge with our community. As always, Lisette is available on Twitter, and these slides will be available on YouTube and on our website if you'd like to download them to look at them again with more information. And from all of us here at the Solve ME/CFS Initiative, this is Emily and Shauna signing off. And thank you again for joining us. And if you have any further questions, our contact information is there on the screen now. If you'd like to register for future webinars, become part of our newsletter, our biobanker registry, and of course, everything we do here at the Solve ME/CFS Initiative is funded by patients and families and loved ones of patients. So if you liked what you saw here today, and if it's helpful to you, please consider a donation to keep our work going. We cannot do what we do without all of your support. So thank you again to our presenter, Lisette Duarte, and thank you to all of you for joining us. Have a wonderful Wednesday afternoon.
Thank you so much.